We're going to talk about a prelude to the Boston Massacre. This is a great story. Sad but great. On February 22nd of 1770, February 22nd of 1770, a clash occurred in Boston. A clash occurred in Boston. What's a clash, Dane? Disagreement, difference of opinion, and depending on how bad it gets, it could be a violent clash, right? Well, this clash that occurred on February 22nd, 1770 was between colonists in America that were loyal to the king and those that saw the British as their enemy. So this is who the clash was between. American colonists who were loyal to the king against those that saw the British as an enemy. By the way, we're going to get to this, but what were people called that were loyal to the king that were American colonists? Tories, or more simply, loyalists. But she's right, Tories too, and we'll talk about that. So this clash that occurred on February 22nd of 1770 was in Boston between loyalists, or those American colonists loyal to the king, and those that saw Britain as an enemy. Okay? Now what happened is an angry mob were in front of a building and they were throwing rocks at the shop that a loyal merchant owned. Now picture that in your mind. This is a store. People are in there. I'm a loyalist, and people that are not loyalists and think the British are enemies are outside throwing rocks at my store, in and out of my store, breaking windows, etc. That's what kind of got this thing going. Okay? Well, another loyalist by the name of Ebenezer Richardson came along and tried to defend the merchant that was getting assaulted. His store was getting assaulted. So as this store is getting assaulted, so to speak, by this angry mob, they're throwing rocks at the shop, they're yelling obscenities, and another loyalist by the name of Ebenezer Richardson kind of came to this merchant's defense to try to help him out. And during the process of helping him out, he got hit in the head with a rock, and he got angry. Okay? So Ebenezer Richardson, who was a loyalist, was seeing another loyalist who owned a business being assaulted by this mob that was against the king. And he steps in and tries to provide assistance, and he's hit in the head with a rock. So he gets mad and he goes back to his house to get his musket, okay, which is a pretty common weapon in those days, a musket. Okay, it's a gun, rifle. So Richardson gets hit in the head with a rock, helping his loyalist business friend, and he goes back to his house for his musket. Well, his house wasn't very far away from this business, and so this whole mob thing is just kind of in the middle of the street. So when he gets to his house for the musket, there are still people, mob out there angry, that have just kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger. So the mob's outside of his house, and probably still outside the merchants. It's just a big bunch of people. Well, Richardson got nervous and he aimed his musket into the mob and began to fire at random. Okay? So Richardson's in his house, he's spearing, he sticks his musket out there and just starts to fire. Just fires at random. Well, unfortunately for him, one of the shots he fired hit an 11-year-old boy by the name of Crispus Attucks right in the chest. So one of these errant shots, I wouldn't even call them errant, one of these shots he took into the crowd happens to hit 11-year-old Crispus Attucks in the chest. Well, Dr. Joseph Warren is called to try to save the youngster's life, who's been hit in the chest. So they take the young boy to Dr. Warren's office. He's a doctor in Boston, and Dr. Joseph Warren will try to save this young man's life. So Dr. Joseph Warren is called. The boy is taken to his office, and Dr. Warren is going to try to save the youngster's life. And he tried feverishly till 9 o'clock that night, but failed in his attempt, so the boy died. So Dr. Warren tries like crazy. The afternoon into the night, finally at 9 o'clock that night, his attempt fails as the boy dies. Now, what I'm telling you now is Dr. Joseph Warren is going to be the founding father that you've never heard of, that no one knows. Very, very important man to this cause of independence, and we'll tell you a lot about him from this point on. How many have ever heard of Dr. Joseph Warren as a founding father? How many even heard of the guy before? Okay, have you heard of it? Well, good. Where did you hear about it? That way, well, your teacher did a good job. Let's see if you're saying this makes sense. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Warren. He was born in Massachusetts, and he graduated from Harvard University. That's how far back Harvard goes, just so you know. So, he grew up in Massachusetts, and he graduated from Harvard University. And at the age of just 28, he was a very popular person in Boston and the most successful doctor without doubt. Okay, my dear, if you want to take those with you, don't be bashful. Okay, so at the age of 28, Harvard educated, he is a very popular person within Boston, and he's the most successful doctor in the city. Now, what you don't know about him, other than the fact that he's a doctor, is he was a major advocate of the rights of American colonists. What's an advocate? If I'm Maddie's advocate, what does that mean? I support her, I'm for her. Okay? If I advocate for her, say she wants to apply for something, if I'm advocating for her, I write her a letter of recommendation. So, Warren was a major advocate of the rights of American colonists. So, is he pro or against the British government parliament, the way they're running things? He's against. He's a very strong critic of British rule in the colonies. He doesn't believe the British should be able to rule the American colonies. That's a simple way to put it. He was an advocate for American colonial rights and felt the British were overstepping their bounds in everything they were doing in America. Okay? And he was speaking all over Boston. And he becomes one of America's most vocal agitators. For who? Who's the agitator? The British. So, you don't know anything about him, but he's a very successful doctor. He has spoken all across Boston about how the colonists' rights are being stomped on by the British. He's one of America's most vocal agitators to the British at the time, among the 13 colonies. Very outspoken against the British rule. And guess what group he wins the support of? The most radical colonists we have going. What? Sons of Liberty. So the Sons of Liberty get all behind Warren. He wins the support of the most radical colonists. Not only colonists that aren't radical, but he's got full support of the Sons of Liberty also. He's got it going. He's got a lot of support in the colonies. Well, what happens on February 26th, 1770, considering what we've talked about that happened on the 22nd? What's happening on the 26th? What is the city of Boston having? What? Not yet. No. For poor old Christopher Seidel, having his funeral. So, 4 days later, on February 26, 1770, they have the funeral procession for this really unknown 11-year-old boy named Christopher Seidel. 5,000 Bostonians went to his funeral. 5,000 went to this little-known 11-year-old's funeral to pay respect that he gave his life for the cause, but also to show what? Protest towards British rule. Okay? So 5,000 Bostonians are part of the funeral procession on February 26, 1770 that took place for Christopher Seidel. Who might you wonder what happened to? Very good. What happened to Ebenezer Richardson? He was on trial, and the judge found him not guilty. Didn't go over real well. He was continually tortured by local patriots, those that were not loyalists, patriots. So his life became incredibly miserable after that point, Ebenezer Richardson. Tortured by colonial patriots. That'll take us to the Boston Massacre. So this death of Christopher Sider is just a prelude to the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre now is going to occur. A lot of it fueled by what? Poor feelings towards what? His death. Okay? So the Boston Massacre. Now, I'll tell you what it did. You had your loyalists and your patriots, right? One thing this death did of Christopher Sider is it united the citizens against the British. So if you were a fence rider, loyalist, or patriot, after this you probably lean more towards what? Being a patriot. So citizens definitely united after Christopher Sider's death. They united. That doesn't mean everybody in Boston was against the king, but you certainly knew what side you were on, one way or the other after that death. Well, as I mentioned, within a few days after Seidel's death and funeral, these British soldiers that were stationed in Boston were getting constantly pelted with snowballs filled with rocks. They were even throwing homemade spears at them and clubbing them. That's what these patriots were doing. And it was all fueled a lot by the death of that 11-year-old boy. So within a few days of the death and burial, British regiments or soldiers were pelted with snowballs, some filled with rocks. A lot of homemade spears were thrown at these guys, and clubs. So, to say the least, the agitation was constant and the friction was high between the patriots and the British soldiers. That's not a good thing, okay? Well, everything came to a head on March 5th, 1770. On March 5th, 1770, this friction between colonists and the British soldiers is going to result in one of the most infamous events in American history. And it occurred on March 5th, 1770. Now, as it was typical before, a large crowd of colonists gathered in Boston, and they kind of surrounded the British soldiers of the 29th British Regiment. Okay, your regiments are labeled. 28th, 27th, 7th Cavalry, okay, 14th Cavalry. Yeah, they all have these names, right? Well, this was the British 29th Regiment. In other words, it were foot soldiers, and they belonged to the 29th Regiment of the British Army. And on March 5th, 1770, a large group of colonists kind of gathered around them, and what were their plans? You know, to do the same agitating. Okay, they're going to throw snowballs, they're going to yell insults, and what this 29th British Regiment is doing that day is they're guarding a customs house. What's a customs house? Tax collector's house, where they probably have any money they collected. So they're guarding and protecting this tax collector and his collection, so to speak. That's what they're doing there. So they're sitting there guarding this customs house, and here come all these colonists with the same insults, throwing rocks, throwing snowballs, combinations of both. Well, as the colonial mob moved closer and closer and closer to these armed British soldiers, finally the order to fire was given. Okay, the order to fire was given. As this mob gets closer and closer and closer to the 29th Regiment, finally the order to fire is given. Well, when the firing stops, 3 colonists were killed and 2 others were mortally wounded. 3 were killed and 2 were mortally wounded. Hunter, what's it mean if you're mortally wounded? No, that's a good guess, but no, mortally wounded. You hope when you go hunting that when you shoot that deer drops immediately. Okay? Okay, but if that deer, if you shoot him and he runs 100 yards and dies, he is mortally wounded. In other words, he doesn't, right, it's a wound that's going to kill you, result in your death. So actually, how many people were killed in that assault? 5. 3 immediately, and 2 died later. So they're mortally wounded. Now, one of those American colonists that were killed of the 5 was Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks. Anybody know anything about Crispus Attucks? Anybody know anything about the man? That's why you're in this class, Maddie, because I'm going to tell you. Anybody know? What are you saying? Well, he was a former slave who had escaped his master 20 years earlier. Okay, he was a former slave, and we're going to get into slavery and how that impacts us into a civil war later. But he was a former slave living free in Boston after freeing from his master 20 years earlier. As a result of this Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks becomes the first American to die in the struggle over colonial freedom between the American colonies and the British. He'll become the first casualty ever in a conflict that America is involved in. Well, he was the first. He was the first. They say it, the first to be shot. So he's among the first. That'd be safe to say he's among the first. Now, obviously, news of this shooting spread. The people of Boston went wild with anger. And guess who gave the name Boston Massacre? Who came up with that name? Good guess. What? Sons of Liberty. So it was the Sons of Liberty that referred to the actions of the British as a massacre. Thus the name Boston Massacre. Well, what might you do if you were the colonists of Massachusetts? If you were the Sons of Liberty or anybody that was for colonial freedom, what might you demand after this happened? What would you demand? Casey, what would you demand? Okay, basically, these are all colonists in here. 5 of your best friends just got shot up by the British. What would you demand after that happened? You just say that's okay. What would you do? What would you demand? What's that? Nobody has ever said that in the entire time. But you know what they always say? Put those guys that shot him on trial, which they did. But nobody has said, ask the British to leave. This gal's on fire, doesn't even know it. The colonists of Massachusetts demanded that all British troops withdraw from the city of Boston. Very good, Case. That's awesome. Most kids say, well, they got to put those guys on trial. Those guys that shot him ought to be on trial. They did. But no one's ever said to me in all the years I've been doing this, ask them to leave. And that's what they did. The people of Massachusetts asked that the British troops leave, be withdrawn. And then, as anger continued, a decision was made to put the British soldiers responsible for the deaths on trial for what? Murder. Okay? So, very Casey. It's awesome. There's nothing embarrassing about being right. What's embarrassing is being right all the time. Now, guess who is going to defend the British soldiers? You'll never guess. You might if you're paying attention. John Adams. You ever heard of John Adams? What do you know about John Adams? Was he like the second president? John Adams defends these British soldiers, and he is a colonial patriot who's a lawyer. He's a patriot. He's not a loyalist. He's a patriot. So you've got a guy that's against British rule in the colonies, who's a lawyer who's defending these British soldiers who shot these 5 people. And he's later going to become the 2nd president of the United States. Now, do you think John Adams had any sympathy for those British soldiers? No. But he believed strongly that everyone should be entitled to a what? A fair trial. So even though he didn't like the British soldiers, and even though he was a patriot, he was a lawyer, and he believed that these people should be given a fair trial. Now, think about this a little bit. Adams was the one that convinced the jury when he defended these soldiers that the soldiers were acting in self-defense and thought that the jury should find them not guilty. Why would he do that if he didn't like them? Other than the fact he thought they should get a fair trial. What might be in the best interest of the patriot cause if these guys go free?
They don't want to start a big war.
You're right. They didn't want to start a hell of a hassle. So Adams pushed hard and even did some strong-arming, so to speak, with jurors on the side, kind of, to make sure that these soldiers went free, because he knew that if they were found guilty, it would actually be worse than if they were not guilty. And you're thinking, well, how could that be? Well, what would they have wanted to do to those soldiers if they were guilty? I mean, you couldn't have done enough to punish them. So that was his thought process. Nobody understood it at all, but it made sense in the end. Okay? So that's the Boston Massacre, which you've probably heard of. Now that takes us to our next subtopic. It is the Townshend Acts are repealed. Ooh, another one they're going to have to eat crow on, right? The Townshend Acts